They say a man becomes a monster the moment the world decides he is one. The first scream echoed through Blackwood Castle just after dusk, sharp and sudden, followed by the frantic sound of footsteps retreating down the marble corridor as another maid fled before even finishing her first hour of service, leaving behind a silver tray trembling on the cold stone floor. Untouched tea slowly cooling beside a single flickering candle that struggled against the heavy shadows swallowing the walls. And at the far end of that corridor, where the light dared not fully reach, stood Damien Blackwood, the Duke no one could look at twice, his presence alone enough to empty rooms, silence conversations, and turn whispers into fearful prayers, not because he spoke harshly or acted cruelly, but because the sight of him reminded people of something they could not name and did not wish to understand, something broken yet unbowed, something that refused to hide yet no longer belonged among them. And so over time, the castle had grown quieter, colder, reduced to echoes and routines performed by those who avoided his gaze, until even the wind seemed to move more carefully through its halls, as if afraid to disturb the stillness he carried like a second skin. And Damien had long since stopped expecting anything else, stopped waiting for footsteps that did not flee, for voices that did not tremble, for eyes that did not dart away at the first glimpse of him. Because fear, at least, was honest. Fear made sense. Fear was predictable, unlike pity, unlike false politeness, unlike the careful lies society wrapped around him like silk over steel. And so he had accepted it, the silence, the distance, the unspoken truth that he was easier to fear than to understand. Until the night the storm came harder than any in recent memory, wind howling across the cliffs, snow cutting through the darkness in sharp, relentless waves, and somewhere beyond the iron gates, a lone figure stumbled through the white, step after step measured not by strength, but by sheer refusal to fall, until at last the heavy doors opened and the storm delivered her into his world, a girl barely standing, her coat thin, her breath visible in fragile bursts. And when she lifted her head, when her eyes met his across the vast, candlelit hall, something shifted, because she did not scream. She did not step back. She did not lower her gaze. She simply looked at him, quietly, steadily, as though she saw not the ruin others feared but the man they refused to acknowledge. And for the first time in years, Damien Blackwood did not know what to do with the absence of fear. The servants watched from a distance as the girl stood in the great hall, her boots leaving faint wet marks across the polished floor, her shoulders trembling not from fear but from the cold that had settled deep into her bones. And still she did not look away from him, not even as the silence stretched thin between them, like something fragile that could shatter at the slightest movement. And Damien felt it, that unfamiliar tension, not the usual discomfort of others shrinking from him, but something sharper, something that unsettled him in ways he could not name. So he stepped forward slowly, each measured step echoing through the vast chamber, the candlelight catching the edge of his scarred features, as if daring her to react, to flinch, to do what everyone else always did. But she remained still, her breath uneven yet her gaze steady, and it was that steadiness that stirred something dangerously close to anger within him. Because fear he could dismiss, fear he could control. But this quiet refusal to yield felt like defiance, like she was seeing past the barrier he had carefully built, and he did not allow that. Not here, not in the only place where he still held power over how he was perceived. "You should not be here," he said, his voice low and controlled, the kind of voice that had once commanded rooms without effort. And yet she only blinked slowly, as if gathering strength rather than retreating. "I had nowhere else to go," she answered, her voice soft but clear, and there was no trembling in it, no hesitation, just a simple truth laid bare between them. And for a moment the storm outside seemed to quiet, as though the world itself paused to listen. Damien studied her then, truly studied her, taking in the worn fabric of her coat, the faint exhaustion in her eyes, the way her hands remained at her sides instead of clutching for protection, and something about it felt wrong. Not her presence, but the way she stood. As though she had already faced something far worse than him. As though whatever had driven her through that storm had stripped fear from her long before she crossed his threshold. And that thought unsettled him more than anything else, because it suggested a world beyond his own suffering, a world where he was not the worst thing a person could encounter, and he did not know whether to reject that idea or resent it. "Look at me," he said suddenly, the command sharper now, edged with something he could not quite contain, and she did not hesitate, not even for a second, her eyes lifting fully to meet his, not skimming past, not softening in pity, just meeting him as one person meets another. And in that moment something shifted again, quieter this time but deeper, like a crack forming beneath layers of stone, because she was not pretending, she was not forcing courage for the sake of survival. She simply was not afraid, and that truth lingered in the space between them, heavier than the storm, heavier than the silence that had ruled this place for years, until Damien turned away first, not out of weakness but because he did not understand what he was seeing, and that lack of understanding felt more dangerous than any fear ever had. The storm did not ease that night, its relentless wind pressing against the tall windows as though determined to force its way inside. Yet within the castle the air had shifted into something quieter, heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, and Damien remained in his study long after he had dismissed the servants, though in truth there had been little to dismiss. Most had already retreated to distant corners of the estate, where his presence felt less immediate, less suffocating. But his thoughts did not retreat. They lingered, circling back again and again to the girl who had stood in his hall without flinching, without lowering her gaze, without offering him the familiar shield of fear he had come to rely on, and it unsettled him in a way he could not ignore, because it was not boldness that disturbed him, not arrogance or ignorance, but something far more dangerous, something quiet and unforced, something that suggested she had already measured him and found no reason to tremble, and that thought lingered like a question. He could not answer, until at last he rose, his steps slow but deliberate as he moved through the dim corridors, guided only by candlelight and the distant memory of where he had ordered her to be taken, a guest room in the east wing, far enough to preserve distance, close enough to maintain control. Yet when he reached the doorway he did not enter immediately. Instead he paused, listening, not for fear but for movement, for any sign that she had finally allowed herself to break under the weight of what she had encountered. But there was nothing, only the faint rustle of fabric and the soft, steady rhythm of breathing, calm, unguarded, and that alone was enough to draw him forward, the door opening with a quiet creak as he stepped inside. The room dim except for a single candle resting near the window, its light casting soft shadows across the walls, and there she sat, not asleep as he had expected, but awake, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze turned toward the flickering flame as though she had been waiting, not for rescue, not for comfort, but simply existing within the stillness. And when she sensed him, she turned, her eyes finding his again without hesitation, and something in his chest tightened, not pain, not anger, but something unfamiliar that refused to be named. "You should rest," he said, though the words felt insufficient even as he spoke them, and she inclined her head slightly, acknowledging rather than submitting. "I will," she replied, her voice quieter now, but no less steady. And again there was no fear, no attempt to soften her presence, only a quiet acceptance of the moment as it was. And Damien found himself standing there longer than necessary, longer than he should have allowed, because leaving would have restored order, would have returned things to the way they had always been. Yet something held him in place, something that resisted that return, until at last he spoke again, his voice lower, edged with something closer to curiosity than command. "What is your name?" And for a brief moment the candlelight flickered stronger, as though marking the shift, and she answered without delay, "Eliza Whitmore," the name settling into the space between them with a weight that felt disproportionate to its simplicity, and Damien repeated it silently, as if testing it, as if anchoring it to something he had not yet fully grasped, because names mattered, names made things real, and for reasons he could not explain, this one did not fade into the background as others had. It remained, steady and present, much like the girl herself. And when he finally turned to leave, the silence that followed did not feel empty as it once had. It felt changed, subtly but undeniably, as though something within the walls of Blackwood Castle had begun to shift, not because of what had been said, but because of what had not been feared. Morning came slowly to Blackwood Castle, not with warmth but with a pale gray light that slipped through tall windows and settled across cold stone floors, revealing dust that no one had bothered to disturb and silence that had long since become part of the structure itself. Yet something was different, something subtle but persistent, as though the stillness no longer held the same weight it once had, and Damien felt it before he understood it, standing by the window of his study with a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in his hand, his thoughts returning not to the storm that had passed but to the girl who had arrived with it, to the way her eyes had met his without hesitation, without calculation, and he found himself unsettled again, not by her presence, but by the absence of the reaction he had come to expect, and that absence lingered like an unanswered question that refused to fade. So when footsteps echoed faintly from the corridor beyond, he did not dismiss them as he normally would. Instead he turned, his gaze fixed on the doorway just as she appeared, moving carefully but without hesitation, her steps quiet yet certain as she carried a small tray with both hands, the porcelain cup upon it steady despite the slight tremor that still lingered in her fingers from the cold she had yet to fully shake, and she paused only briefly upon seeing him before continuing forward, not rushing, not faltering, simply approaching as though this moment held no more weight than any other, and that alone was enough to tighten something in his chest, because there was no performance in her actions, no attempt to impress or appease, only a quiet intention to do what she had decided to do. And when she reached the desk, she set the tray down with care, the soft clink of porcelain against wood the only sound that broke the silence between them. "You did not drink your coffee," she said, her voice gentle but direct, and he stared at her for a moment longer than necessary, not at the words but at the ease with which she spoke them, as though addressing him required no special consideration, no adjustment, no caution, and that ease felt foreign, almost intrusive, because it slipped past the barriers he had built without effort. "It was not needed," he replied, his tone controlled, yet there was something beneath it, something less certain than before, and she simply nodded, accepting the answer without pressing further, without questioning, and that acceptance unsettled him even more than resistance might have, because it offered no conflict to hold on to, no justification for distance, only a quiet presence that refused to be dismissed. And as she turned to leave, her gaze drifting briefly toward the tall window where the morning light had begun to soften the edges of the room, he found himself speaking again before he had decided to. "Why are you not afraid?" The question leaving him sharper than intended, cutting through the air with an edge that had once commanded immediate retreat, yet she paused instead of fleeing, her hand resting lightly against the back of a chair as she considered his words, not hurried, not defensive, simply thoughtful, and when she turned back to him, her expression held no challenge, no defiance, only a quiet certainty that seemed to exist beyond his reach. "Because fear changes nothing," she said, her voice steady, and the simplicity of it struck him harder than any explanation could have, because it left no room for argument, no space for the assumptions he had built his isolation upon, and for a moment neither of them moved, the silence stretching between them not as a barrier, but as something shared, something that neither of them seemed willing to break, until at last she inclined her head slightly and stepped away, leaving behind the untouched coffee and a question that refused to settle, and Damien remained where he stood, his gaze lingering on the space she had occupied, realizing with a quiet, unsettling clarity that for the first time in years, someone had entered his world without asking permission and had not been driven out by fear, and he did not yet know whether that made her a threat or something far more dangerous. The days that followed did not return to what they had been, though no one within Blackwood Castle could have explained exactly why, only that something unseen had shifted in the rhythm of the halls, in the way footsteps echoed, in the way silence no longer felt as absolute as before, and Damien noticed it most in the smallest details, in the faint scent of fresh air drifting from windows that had once remained sealed, in the subtle order that began to replace neglect in corners long forgotten. And he knew without being told that she was the cause, not through grand gestures or defiance, but through quiet persistence that left no room for resistance, and it unsettled him more with each passing hour, because it was not something he could command or dismiss. It simply existed, steady and unyielding, much like her gaze had been that first night, and he found himself watching for it, listening for it, though he would not have admitted such a thing even to himself, until one afternoon, when the light stretched longer through the tall windows and the castle seemed almost reluctant to sink back into shadow. He saw her again in the courtyard below, her figure small against the vast stone walls as she knelt beside a cluster of withered plants, her hands moving carefully through the soil as though tending to something fragile, something worth saving. And for a long moment, he remained at the window, observing from a distance that felt both necessary and insufficient, because there was nothing remarkable in what she was doing, nothing that should have drawn his attention, and yet it did, not because of the act itself, but because of the way she approached it, with the same quiet certainty, the same absence of hesitation, as though she believed something broken could be restored simply because she chose not to abandon it. And that belief stirred something within him that he had long since buried beneath acceptance and distance, something that did not belong in the life he had constructed, and before he could stop himself, he turned from the window and made his way down, his steps measured but quicker than usual, as though driven by something he did not fully understand, until he reached the courtyard and she looked up, her hands stilling only briefly before resuming their gentle work. "These were left to die," she said softly, not as an accusation but as an observation, and he followed her gaze to the brittle stems, the faded leaves clinging stubbornly to life, and something in his expression hardened, not in anger but in defense. "Some things are beyond saving," he replied, the words familiar, almost rehearsed, yet as soon as they left him they felt less certain than they once had, because she shook her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in quiet refusal to accept the finality of it. "Only if no one tries," she answered, her voice steady. And again that simplicity unsettled him, because it did not challenge him directly. It simply existed alongside his belief, offering an alternative he had never allowed himself to consider. And he found himself standing there longer than necessary, watching as she continued, her hands brushing away dead leaves, her movements patient, deliberate, as though time itself did not matter, as though restoration was not measured in results but in the willingness to begin. And for the first time in years, Damien felt something unfamiliar press against the edges of his carefully controlled world. Not hope, not yet, but something quieter, something more dangerous. The possibility that what he had accepted as permanent might not be as fixed as he believed, and that realization lingered with him long after he turned away, following him through the halls, through the silence, settling into the spaces he had once kept empty, until even the castle itself seemed to hold it, waiting, as though aware that something long dormant had begun, however quietly, to awaken. That evening the air inside Blackwood Castle carried a strange stillness, not the heavy silence Damien had grown accustomed to, but something lighter, as if the walls themselves were listening, and he found no comfort in it, only a growing unease that followed him from room to room like a shadow he could not outrun, because every corner now seemed touched by her presence, not visibly, not in any way that could be named, but in the subtle order that had begun to replace neglect, in the faint traces of care left behind in spaces long abandoned. And it disturbed him more than chaos ever had, because it suggested intention, persistence, something that refused to disappear. And as night settled and the castle dimmed once more, he sought refuge in what had always grounded him: routine, distance, control. Yet even those felt altered, as though they no longer held the same authority they once did, until at last he turned toward the east wing again, not with purpose, but with something closer to compulsion. His steps slower this time, more measured, as though he were approaching something he did not fully understand. And when he reached the corridor outside her room, he paused, the faint glow of candlelight slipping beneath the door, steady and unwavering. And for a moment he considered turning away, restoring the distance he had spent years perfecting. But instead he remained, listening. And through the quiet he heard it, not words, not movement, but something softer. The almost imperceptible sound of pages turning, and it unsettled him in a way he had not anticipated, because it was such a simple thing, such an ordinary sound. Yet within these walls it felt unfamiliar, out of place, like life returning to a space that had forgotten how to hold it. And before he could reconsider, he opened the door, the hinges barely whispering as he stepped inside. and there she was, seated near the window with a small book resting in her hands. The candle beside her casting a warm glow that softened the sharp edges of the room, and for a brief moment she did not notice him, her attention fixed on the page as though the world beyond it did not exist, and something in that quiet focus held him still, because it was not avoidance, not escape, but presence, complete and unguarded, and when she finally looked up, her expression did not shift in surprise or alarm, only in quiet acknowledgement, as though she had expected him to be there all along. "You should be resting," he said again. The same words as before, yet they carried less weight now, less command, and she closed the book gently, her fingers lingering against its cover for a moment before she set it aside. "I am," she replied, her voice soft but certain, and he frowned slightly, not in anger but in confusion, because her answer did not align with his understanding, did not fit within the boundaries he had defined. "That is, not rest," he said, his tone sharper now, seeking clarity, seeking control, and she tilted her head slightly, considering him, not with challenge but with a quiet patience that felt more disarming than any defiance. "It is for me," she answered, and again that simple certainty unsettled him, because it did not argue, did not explain, it simply existed, and for a moment the room seemed to narrow around them. The distance between them no longer defined by fear, but by something far more fragile. Something that could not be controlled or dismissed, and Damien found himself stepping closer without realizing it, drawn not by intention but by the absence of resistance, until he stood just within the reach of the candlelight, its warmth brushing against him in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost intrusive, and for the first time in years, he became aware of how cold he had been. Not just in body but in everything he had allowed himself to feel, and that awareness lingered, quiet and undeniable, as Eliza watched him without fear, without pity, simply present, and in that moment he realized with a clarity that unsettled him to his core that she was not trying to change him, not trying to fix what the world had broken. She was simply refusing to treat him as something that needed to be feared, and that refusal, more than anything else, was beginning to unravel the distance he had built, thread by thread, until he no longer knew where it began or where it might end. The following day did not announce itself with anything remarkable, yet Damien felt it the moment he stepped into the corridor, a subtle tension in the air that did not belong to the castle he had known for years, as though something unseen had begun to shift beneath the surface, and he moved through the halls with a quiet awareness he could not suppress, his senses attuned not to danger, but to presence, to the faint signs that she had passed through these spaces before him, and when he reached the library, a room long abandoned to dust and silence, he paused at the threshold, because the door stood open, just slightly, enough to reveal a thin line of light stretching across the floor, and that alone was enough to draw him in, his steps slower now, more deliberate, until the room unfolded before him in a way he had not seen in years, the curtains partially drawn to allow pale daylight to filter in, shelves no longer buried beneath neglect but touched, reordered, and at the center of it all, Eliza stood on a small wooden stool, reaching carefully toward the upper shelves, her fingers brushing along the spines of books as though searching for something she could not yet name, and for a moment he said nothing, simply watched, because there was something quietly defiant in the way she occupied the space, not claiming it, not demanding it, but restoring it, piece by piece, as though it had never been meant to remain empty. And when she finally noticed him, her hands stilled but did not retreat, her balance steady even as she turned her head slightly. "This room was forgotten," she said, her voice soft but certain, and Damien's gaze moved slowly across the shelves, taking in details he had long since chosen to ignore, the dust disturbed, the order returning, the quiet signs of care that had begun to replace abandonment, and something within him resisted it, not because it was wrong, but because it challenged something he had accepted as unchangeable. "It was left that way for a reason," he replied, his tone controlled, though less certain than it once would have been, and she stepped down from the stool with care, her movements unhurried, as though time itself bent slightly around her presence. "Then perhaps the reason is no longer needed," she answered, and again her words did not challenge him directly. They simply existed alongside his, offering an alternative that refused to be dismissed, and he felt it then, that quiet pressure building beneath the surface, not from her, but from the space itself, from the way the room no longer reflected the isolation he had chosen, and he stepped further inside without realizing it, his hand brushing lightly against the edge of a table as though grounding himself in something familiar. "You assume too much," he said, though the words lacked their former certainty, and she met his gaze again, not with defiance, but with something steadier, something that held its ground without force. "I do not assume," she replied. "I only see what is in front of me." And that struck him in a way he had not expected, because it left no room for the past he had hidden behind, no space for the distance he had maintained, only the present moment, unfiltered, undeniable, and for the first time in years, Damien found himself standing in a room that did not echo his solitude, but challenged it, quietly, persistently, until even the silence felt different, no longer empty, but waiting, and as he turned to leave, his steps slower than before, he realized with a quiet unease that the control he had relied on was no longer absolute. Not because it had been taken from him, but because he was beginning, however reluctantly, to loosen his hold on it. The shift did not go unnoticed beyond the castle walls, because silence, when broken, carries farther than noise ever could, and within days the surrounding estates began to whisper again, not with curiosity, but with the same careful caution that had once kept them at a distance. And word reached Blackwood in the form of a letter sealed in wax, delivered with hesitation by a messenger who did not linger long enough to be seen. And Damien held it in his hand longer than necessary, the weight of it familiar, unwelcome, because he knew what it represented before he broke the seal. The outside world returning, not out of concern but out of obligation, drawn by duty, by curiosity, by the quiet hope that nothing had truly changed, and yet something had, though he had not yet decided what that meant. And as the letter unfolded beneath his fingers, its contents confirmed what he had expected, a formal notice of an upcoming visit. Neighboring nobles who had avoided his estate for years now, choosing to reappear under the guise of courtesy, and he felt the old tension return, not fear, not anticipation, but the controlled detachment he had relied on for so long, because he understood that their presence would bring with it the same looks, the same carefully hidden reactions, the same silent judgments that had shaped the life he had accepted, and for a moment he considered refusing, closing the gates, restoring the distance that had protected him, but the thought did not settle as easily as it once would have, because another image lingered beside it. Eliza standing in the courtyard, her hands in the soil, her voice steady as she spoke of things not being beyond saving, and that memory disrupted the certainty he had relied upon, not enough to change his decision, but enough to make it feel less absolute. And when he found her later that afternoon, she was once again in the library, the room now holding more light than shadow, the air less stagnant, as though the space itself had begun to breathe again. And he paused at the doorway, watching as she adjusted a row of books, her movements precise, unhurried. And for a moment he said nothing, because the words he intended felt insufficient against the quiet presence she carried. Yet he spoke them anyway. "We will have guests." And she turned, her expression unchanged, her gaze steady as it met his. Not with surprise, not with concern, simply acknowledging what had been said, and he waited then, though he did not know why, perhaps expecting hesitation, perhaps expecting the same tension others would have shown, but she only inclined her head slightly. "Then the castle will be ready," she replied, and again that answer unsettled him, not because it dismissed the weight of what he had said, but because it accepted it without fear, without resistance, as though the presence of others held no more significance than the presence of him. And something in his chest tightened at that, because he knew what those guests would see, what they would remember, what they would carry back with them once they left, and he knew, with a clarity that felt sharper than before, that their judgment would not be softened by time. But her gaze remained unchanged, steady, unwavering, and for the first time he wondered not how they would see him, but how she would. When the world he had kept at bay stepped fully into the space she had begun to reshape, and that question lingered long after he left the room, following him through the corridors, settling into the silence that no longer felt entirely his own, as though the castle itself awaited the moment when what had begun in quiet would be tested beneath the weight of everything he had tried to keep outside. The day of their arrival came wrapped in a stillness that felt heavier than any storm. The sky pale and unmoving above the vast grounds of Blackwood Castle, as carriage wheels finally broke the long silence of the estate, their slow, deliberate approach echoing across the gravel path like a reminder of a world Damien had chosen to leave behind. And he stood at the top of the grand staircase, not in welcome but in readiness, his posture controlled, his expression unreadable, the same mask he had worn for years settling back into place with practiced ease. Yet beneath it something resisted, something that had not existed before, something that refused to quiet completely. And when the doors opened and the first of the guests stepped inside, their movements careful, their voices measured, he saw it immediately. The flicker of recognition followed by the swift attempt to conceal it, the subtle tightening of shoulders, the brief hesitation before their gazes found safer ground. And it was all as expected, familiar, predictable, the same pattern repeating itself as it always had. And for a moment he allowed himself to settle into it, to reclaim the certainty that came with knowing exactly how he would be seen, exactly how distance would be maintained, until he became aware of something else, something that did not belong to that pattern, and his gaze shifted slightly, just enough to find her, standing near the edge of the hall, not hidden, not removed, simply present, her posture composed, her expression calm, and she was watching, not the guests, not the room, but him, and there was no change in her gaze, no reflection of the discomfort that had filled the space, no echo of the reactions that surrounded him, only the same quiet steadiness that had unsettled him from the beginning. And it broke something, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to feel it, a crack in the structure he had relied on, because for the first time, the way others saw him was not the only thing reflected back. There was another perspective, one that did not align with the rest, one that did not reinforce the role he had accepted, and it lingered, persistent, impossible to ignore, even as the formalities began. Even as voices filled the hall with polite conversation and practiced civility, even as he moved through it all with the same measured control, responding where required, maintaining the distance expected, and yet throughout it, he remained aware of her, not because she drew attention, but because she did not, because her presence did not shift to accommodate the tension, did not bend to match the discomfort of others, and that absence of change stood out more than any reaction could have. Until the moment came when one of the guests, a man whose confidence had not been dulled by caution, allowed his words to stray just enough beyond politeness to carry an edge, subtle but unmistakable. And though the room did not fall silent, something within it tightened, the air growing thinner, waiting, watching, and Damien felt it, that familiar expectation of withdrawal, of dismissal, of quiet acceptance of what had always been implied. Yet before he could respond, before he could retreat into the role he knew so well, her voice entered the space. Calm, steady, unforced, not raised, not sharp, but clear enough to be heard. And it did not challenge, it did not accuse, it simply redirected, shifting the moment without confrontation, and that alone was enough to disrupt the balance, enough to alter the direction of the room. And in the subtle shift that followed, Damien realized with a clarity that unsettled him more than any insult could have that the world he had kept at a distance no longer held the same power over him, not because it had changed, but because she had not, and that difference, that quiet, unwavering presence, had begun to reshape the way he stood within it, even as the guests continued to speak, even as the evening carried on, because for the first time, he was no longer standing alone beneath their gaze. The evening stretched longer than expected, the formal dinner unfolding beneath the golden glow of chandeliers that had not been lit in years, their light reflecting across polished silver and crystal as though the castle itself were attempting to remember what it once had been. And Damien moved through it with practiced precision, every gesture measured, every word carefully placed, yet beneath the surface something continued to shift, subtle but persistent, like a quiet current beneath still water, because the presence of others no longer held the same absolute weight it once had, not when there was another presence within the room that did not bend to it. And he felt it each time his gaze drifted, Each time it found her standing just beyond the center of attention, not seeking notice, not avoiding it, simply existing with that same calm certainty that had begun to unravel something he could not rebuild. And it was not her actions that unsettled him, not what she said or did, but what she refused to do. She did not adjust, did not mirror the careful politeness of the guests, did not lower herself into the quiet expectations that shaped the room, and that refusal created a contrast that could not be ignored, even if no one else named it. And as the evening deepened, the conversations grew more relaxed, the restraint of arrival giving way to the familiar rhythm of social exchange. Yet beneath it there remained an undercurrent, something unspoken but present, a quiet awareness of him that never fully disappeared, and he had long since learned how to navigate it, how to exist within it without acknowledging it, until now, because now there was something else within the same space, something that disrupted the pattern without drawing attention to itself. And when the conversation turned, as it inevitably did, toward the past, toward stories that circled carefully around what was known but never directly spoken, he felt the familiar tightening of distance begin to form, the subtle shift in tone, the careful phrasing that masked curiosity as concern, and he prepared, instinctively, to retreat into silence, to allow the moment to pass as it always had. But before the pattern could settle, before the weight of it could take hold, he heard it again, her voice, not interrupting, not confronting, simply entering the conversation, with a quiet clarity that redirected its course, offering a different focus, a different path. And it was enough, not to silence the room, but to change it, to ease the tension that had begun to gather. And for the first time, Damien did not withdraw, he remained, his attention no longer fixed solely on maintaining distance but drawn, inevitably, to the presence that had altered the balance without force. And something within him responded, not in words, not in action, but in the simple absence of retreat. And as the evening continued, he found himself less confined by the expectations that had once defined every interaction, less bound to the role he had accepted. And when at last the gathering began to disperse, the guests retreating to their assigned rooms, their voices fading into the corridors, the castle settling once more into quiet, he remained where he stood, the echo of their presence still lingering, yet no longer overwhelming. And his gaze moved once more to where she stood, still composed, still unchanged. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because nothing needed to be said. The shift had already occurred, not in the room, not in the guests, but in him. And he understood then, with a clarity that no longer unsettled but steadied, that the world beyond these walls had not softened, had not changed its view, but his place within it had begun to, not because he had forced it, not because he had fought against it, but because someone had stood beside him without fear and had not stepped away, and that presence, quiet and unwavering, had begun to redefine the distance he had once believed could never be crossed. The castle did not return to silence in the same way after that night, because something had shifted too deeply to be undone by the departure of guests or the closing of doors, and Damien felt it most in the quiet moments that followed, in the absence of tension where it had once been constant, in the unfamiliar ease that lingered in spaces that had always demanded distance. And it unsettled him not because it was unwelcome, but because it was unknown, and he found himself standing once more in the courtyard as the early morning light spread across the stone, softer now, less harsh, catching on the edges of newly tended plants that had begun, almost imperceptibly, to regain color. And she was there again, as she often was, her presence as consistent as the changes she had brought. And for a time he simply watched, not from a distance meant to separate, but from one that allowed him to see without interruption. And there was something different in the way he observed her now, not searching for explanation, not questioning what he did not understand, but recognizing, slowly, that what she had brought into this place was not something that needed to be explained, only accepted. And when he finally stepped forward, his approach no longer carried the same guarded precision. There was a quiet steadiness to it, as though the space between them no longer required careful navigation. And she looked up as she always did, without hesitation, her gaze meeting his with that same calm certainty, unchanged by everything that had passed, unchanged by the presence of others, unchanged by the world beyond the walls that had once defined him. "They will speak of this place differently now," he said, his voice lower, less controlled, not in weakness but in the absence of the need to maintain it. And she considered his words briefly before responding, her tone thoughtful but untroubled. "Perhaps," she said, "but that does not change what it is." And he understood then that she was not concerned with how the world would interpret what had occurred, not concerned with reputation or perception, only with what existed within the present moment. And that understanding settled into him with a clarity that felt both foreign and grounding, because for so long he had defined himself through the eyes of others, through the distance they created, through the silence they left behind. And now that silence had been broken, not by force, not by confrontation, but by something far quieter, something that had simply refused to acknowledge it as permanent. And he found himself speaking again, not out of obligation, not out of expectation, but because the words no longer felt unnecessary. "Why did you stay?" he asked, the question carrying more weight than its simplicity suggested. And for a moment she did not answer, her attention returning briefly to the soil beneath her hands, as though grounding herself in something tangible before lifting her gaze once more. "Because you were here," she said, and the words were so simple, so unguarded, that they struck him more deeply than anything that had been said before, because there was no reasoning behind them, no justification, no condition, only a quiet truth that existed without explanation. And in that moment Damien understood something he had not allowed himself to consider, that what she had given him was not change imposed from the outside, not something forced upon him by circumstance, but something offered without demand, something that had allowed him, for the first time in years, to see himself without the weight of fear attached to it. And that realization did not come with certainty or resolution, but with something quieter, something that did not rush or overwhelm, something that simply remained, steady and present, much like her. And as he stood there, the morning light growing stronger around them, he realized that whatever had begun within these walls was not something that would end with the departure of guests or the passing of time. It was something that had taken root, quietly, deeply, and for the first time in years, he did not feel the need to turn away from it. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet continuity that no longer felt fragile, as though what had begun within the walls of Blackwood Castle had settled into something steadier, something that did not require constant attention to remain. And Damien found himself moving through his own home with a different awareness, not of absence, but of presence, of subtle changes that no longer startled him but instead felt expected. And it was in those moments, in the absence of resistance, that the realization grew clearer, that what had once defined him no longer held the same authority, not because it had disappeared, but because it had been placed beside something else, something that did not bend beneath it. And he felt it most when he stood before the great mirror in his chamber, the one he had avoided for years, not out of fear but out of indifference, because it had never shown him anything he had not already accepted. Yet now, as he faced it, there was a hesitation he did not recognize, not in turning away, but in looking, truly looking. And for a moment he saw what he had always seen, the same reflection, unchanged, the same marks that had shaped the way others reacted, the same image that had defined the distance he had maintained. And yet something within that image no longer felt fixed, no longer carried the same finality, because the weight attached to it had shifted, quietly, almost imperceptibly. And he realized then that it was not the reflection that had changed, but the way he was beginning to see it, not through the eyes of those who had turned away, but through the absence of that reaction, through the quiet steadiness of someone who had looked and found nothing to fear. And that understanding settled into him with a depth that no confrontation could have achieved, because it did not demand anything of him. It did not require him to change. It simply offered a different way of standing within what already existed. And as he turned from the mirror, his movements slower, more deliberate, he found himself seeking her again, not out of uncertainty, but out of something closer to intention. And when he found her, she was once more in the courtyard, her hands moving through the soil that had begun to show small signs of life, green breaking through where there had once been only gray. And he paused for a moment, observing not the change itself, but the quiet consistency that had made it possible. And when he stepped forward, His presence no longer carried the same guarded edge. She looked up as she always did. Without hesitation, her gaze meeting his with the same calm certainty, unchanged by everything that had unfolded. And for a moment he said nothing, because the words he had relied on for so long no longer felt necessary. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, not in volume, but in weight. "It is different now," he said, and she followed his gaze briefly to the small signs of growth before returning it to him. Her expression thoughtful but steady. "It always could be," she replied, and the simplicity of it did not diminish its truth, because he understood now that what had changed was not the world around him, not the castle, not the past that had shaped him, but the space within which he chose to stand, and that space no longer belonged solely to the silence he had accepted. And as the light shifted across the courtyard, catching on the new growth, reflecting softly against the stone, Damien remained where he was, no longer at a distance, no longer removed, but present, fully and without hesitation. And for the first time in years, the stillness around him did not feel like isolation. It felt like something else entirely, something that had not replaced what came before, but had reshaped it into something he could finally stand within without turning away. Spring arrived at Blackwood Castle without announcement, not in a sudden burst of color, but in quiet persistence, in the way the light lingered a little longer across the stone walls, in the way the air no longer carried the same cold weight it once had. And Damien stood once more at the edge of the courtyard, not as an observer removed from what lay before him, but as part of it. His presence no longer defined by distance, but by something steadier, something that had taken root alongside the changes he had once resisted. And as his gaze moved across the small garden that had begun to awaken under Eliza's care, he saw not just growth, but evidence, quiet proof that what had once seemed beyond saving had simply been left untouched for too long. And the realization no longer unsettled him, it grounded him, because it mirrored something within himself that he had only recently begun to understand, that nothing had been as final as he had believed, only unchallenged. And when he turned, he found her there as he often did now, not because she sought him, not because he sought her, but because their paths no longer required separation, and she stood beside him without hesitation, her gaze following his toward the garden, her presence as calm and unwavering as it had been from the beginning. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because the silence between them no longer needed to be filled. It was no longer empty. It held something quiet and certain that neither of them questioned. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the weight it once had, no guarded edge, no distance carefully maintained, only a simple truth that had taken time to surface. "They will remember me differently," he said. And it was not a question, not a hope, but an acknowledgement of something already in motion. And she glanced at him then, her expression thoughtful but unchanged. "Perhaps," she replied, "but what matters is how you remember yourself." And the words settled into him with a clarity that did not demand agreement, did not require justification. They simply remained, steady and present, much like everything she had brought into his life. And he understood then that what had changed was not the world beyond these walls, not the people who would carry their own perceptions with them, but the way he now stood within it, no longer defined by what others saw, no longer confined by the silence he had accepted. And as he looked out once more across the courtyard, the light catching on new leaves, on life returning where there had once been none, he felt something shift fully into place, not as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet certainty that had been building from the moment she had first looked at him without fear. And for the first time, he did not feel like something apart from the world around him. He felt part of it, not because it had changed, but because he had allowed himself to stand within it without turning away. And as the wind moved gently through the garden, carrying with it the faint promise of what was still to come, Damien remained where he was, not looking back, not retreating, but simply present. And in that presence, he found something he had not realized he had lost, something that had never been given to him by the world, but had been returned to him by a single, quiet refusal to see him as something to fear. And though nothing around him had been rewritten, everything within him had begun, at last, to be understood differently.